Oh, okay. This is just to hold me more accountable, get me to read more. I'm currently reading The Stranger. I'm on part 2, so about halfway through the book. Split into 2 parts. Recap of the last one. After I read this chapter, I'm gonna try to summarize it the best I can, and then watch a video summarizing it to see how well my retention is. As far as I remember, it's been a couple days, but the end of part 1 was chapter 6, I think. The chapter 6, part 1, the end of it, Marcel was on a beach and is staying there with Ramon. So it's Marcel, Ramon, Masson, Madame Masson, and Marie. I think those are the 5. And 4 of them are in the cabin. Marcel walked out with a pistol that he took from Raymond, who was trying to blast away the Muslims. And then he found one of the Muslims laying on the ground, like looking at him, like just resting in the sun because they're on a beach. And then just a lot of the, like in my opinion, overly descriptive heat imagery and visions, all that stuff. And then he just, at the end of the chapter, he just kind of shoots him until the revolver's empty. So that's where we're at. We're going to pick up from there. So here we go. Chapter 1, Part 2. Right after my arrest, I was questioned several times, but it was just so they could find out who I was, which didn't take long. The first time at the police station, nobody seemed very interested in my case. A week later, however, the examining magistrate looked me over with curiosity. But to get things started, he simply asked me my name and address and my occupation, the date and place of my birth. Then he wanted to know if I had hired an attorney. I admitted I hadn't and inquired whether it was really necessary to have one. "Why do you ask?" he said. I said I thought my case was pretty simple. He smiled and said, "That's your opinion, but the law is the law, and if you don't hire an attorney yourself, the court will appoint one." I thought it was very convenient that the court should take care of those details. I told him so. He agreed with me and concluded that it was a good law. At first, I didn't take him seriously. I was led into a curtained room where there was a single lamp on his desk, which was shining on a chair where he had me sit while he remained standing in the shadows. I had read descriptions of scenes like this in books, and it all seemed like a game to me. After our conversation, though, I looked at him and saw a tall, fine-featured man with deep-set blue eyes, a long gray mustache, and lots of thick, almost white hair. Ooh, lots of imagery. He struck me as being a very reasonable and overall quite pleasant, despite a nervous tic which made his mouth twitch now and then. On my way out, I was even going to shake his hand, but just in time I remembered that I had killed a man. The next day, a lawyer came to see me at the prison. He was short and chubby, quite young, his hair carefully slicked back. Despite the heat, I was in my shirt sleeves. He had on a dark suit, a wing collar, and an odd-looking tie with broad black and white stripes. He put the briefcase he was carrying down on my bed, introduced himself, and he said that he had gone over my file. My case was a tricky one, but he had no doubts we'd win, if I trusted him. I thanked him and he said, "Let's get down to business." He sat down on the bed and explained to me that there had been some investigations into my private life. It had been learned that my mother had died recently at the home. Inquiries had then been made in Marengo. The investigators had learned that I show insensitivity the day of Mamon's funeral, Mamon being his mother. "You understand," my lawyer said. "It's a little embarrassing for me to have to ask you this, but it's very important, and it will be a strong argument for the prosecution if I can't come up with some answers." He wanted me to help him. He asked if I had felt any sadness that day. The question caught me by surprise, and it seemed to me that I would have been very embarrassed if I had to ask it. Nevertheless, I answered that I pretty much lost the habit of analyzing myself, and that it was hard for me to tell him what he wanted to know. I probably did love Mammon, but that didn't mean anything. At one time, people have wished their loved ones were dead. Here the lawyer interrupted me, and he seemed very upset. He made me promise I wouldn't say that at my hearing or in front of the examining magistrate. I explained to him, however, that my nature was such that my physical needs often got in the way of my feelings. The day I buried Mammon, I was very tired and sleepy, so much so that I wasn't really aware of what was going on. What I can say for certain is that I would rather Mammon hadn't died, but my lawyer didn't seem satisfied. He said that's not enough. He thought for a minute. He asked me if he could say that day I had held back my natural feelings. I said no, because it's not true. He gave me a strange look as if he found me slightly disgusting. He told me in an almost snide way that in any case the director and the staff of the home would be called as witnesses and that things could get very nasty for me. I pointed out to him that none of this had anything to do with my case, but he said that it was obvious that I had never had any dealings with the law. He left, looking angry. I wish I could have made him stay to explain that I wanted things between us to be good, not so that he'd defend me better, but if I can put it this way, good in a natural way. Mostly, I could tell, I made him feel uncomfortable. He didn't understand me, and he was sort of holding it against me. I felt the urge to reassure him that I was like everybody else, just like everybody else. But there really wasn't much point, and I gave up the idea out of laziness. I gotta figure out what the point of this is, because he's just such a, like, throughout the whole book, he's showing, like, no emotion. It's kind of freaky. It's a little weird. Like, the first line of the book's just, my mom died today, or I think yesterday. I don't really remember. A girl's asking, Marie's asking him constantly, like, oh, hey, do you love me? Probably not. Would you want to get married? Which is a crazy thing to ask after being told he doesn't know if he loves you. And it would make a difference. I don't have those kinds of feelings for you. And he just murders a guy. Doesn't give a fuck about his mom's funeral. Bro, what? Who is this guy? Shortly after that, I was taken before the examining magistrate again. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and this time his office was filled with sunlight barely softened by a flimsy curtain. It was very hot. He had me sit down and very politely informed me that, due to unforeseen circumstances, my lawyer had been unable to come, but I had the right to remain silent and to wait for my lawyer's counsel. I said that I could answer for myself. He pressed a button on the table. A young clerk came in and sat down right behind me. The two of us leaned back in our chairs, and the examination began. He started out by saying that people were describing me as a taciturn and withdrawn person, and he wanted to know what I thought. I answered, it's just that I don't have much to say, so I keep quiet. He smiled the way he had the first time, agreed that this was not the best reason of all, and added, besides, it's not important. Then he looked at me without saying anything, leaned forward rather abruptly, and said very quickly, what interests me is you. I didn't really understand what he meant by that, so I didn't respond. There are 1 or 2 things, he added, that I don't quite understand. I'm sure you'll help me clear them up. I said it was all pretty simple. He pressed me to go back over that day. I went back over what I had already told him. Raymond, the beach, the swim, the quarrel, then back to the beach, the little spring, the sun, and then 5 shots from the revolver. After each sentence he would say, fine, fine. When I got to the body lying there, he nodded and said, good. But I was tired of repeating the same story over and over. It seemed as if I had never talked so much in my life. After a short silence, he stood up and told me that he wanted to help me, that I interested him, and that, with God's help, he would do something for me. But first he wanted me to ask me a few more questions. Without working up to it, he asked if I loved Mammon. I said yes, the same as anyone. And the clerk, who then been typing steadily, must have hit the wrong key because he lost his place and had to go back. Again, without any apparent logic, the magistrate then asked if I had fired all 5 shots at once. I thought for a minute and then explained that at first I had fired a single shot, and then a few seconds later, on the other 4. Then he said, why did you pause between the first and the second shot? Once again I could see the red sand and feel the burning of the sun on my forehead, but this time I didn't answer. In the silence that followed, the magistrate seemed to be getting fidgety. He sat down, ran his fingers through his hair, put his elbows on the desk, and leaned towards me slightly with a strange look on his face. Why? Why did you shoot at a body that was on the ground? Once again, I didn't know how to answer. The magistrate ran his hands across his forehead and repeated the question with a slightly different tone in his voice. Why? You must tell me. Why? Still, I didn't say anything. Suddenly he stood up, strode over to a far corner of his office, and pulled out a drawer in a file cabinet. He took out a silver crucifix which he'd brandished as he came toward me. In a completely different, almost cracked voice, he shouted, "Do you know what this is?" I said, "Yes, of course." Speaking quickly and passionately, he told me that he believed in God, that it was his conviction that no man was so guilty that God would not forgive him, but in order for that to happen, a man must repent, and in doing so become like a child whose heart is open and ready to embrace all. He was leaning all the way over the table. He was waving his crucifix almost directly over my head. To tell the truth, I had found it very hard to follow his reasoning. First, because I was hot and there was big flies in his office that kept landing on my face, and also because he was scaring me a little. At the same time, I knew that was ridiculous because, after all, I was the criminal. He went on anyway. I vaguely understood that to his mind there was just one thing that wasn't clear in my confession, the fact that I hesitated before I fired my second shot. The rest was fine, but that part he couldn't understand. I was about to tell him he was wrong to dwell on it because it really didn't matter, but he cut me off and urged me one last time, drawing myself up to his full height and asking me if I believed in God. I said no. He sat down indignantly. He said it was impossible. All men believed in God, even those who turned their backs on him. That was his belief, and if he were ever to doubt it, his life would become meaningless. "Do you want my life to be meaningless?" he shouted. As far as I could see, it didn't have anything to do with me, and I told him so. But from across the table he had already thrust the crucifix in my face and was screaming irrationally, "I am a Christian. I ask him to forgive you your sins. How can you not believe that he suffered for you?" I was struck by how sincere he seemed, but I had had enough. It was getting hotter and hotter. As always, whenever I want to get rid of someone I'm not really listening to, I made it appear as if I agreed. To my surprise, he acted triumphant. You see, he said. "You do believe, don't you? And you're going to place your trust in him, aren't you?" Obviously, again, I said no. He fell back in his chair. He seemed very tired. He didn't say anything for a minute, while the typewriter, which hadn't let up the whole time, was still tapping out the last few sentences. Then he looked at me closely and with a little sadness in his face. In a low voice he said, "I have never seen a soul as hardened as yours. The criminals who have come before me have always wept at the sight of this image of suffering." I was about to say that was precisely because they were criminals, but then I realized that I was one too. It was an idea I couldn't get used to. Then the judge stood up, as if to give me the signal that the examination was over. He simply asked, in the same weary tone, if I was sorry for what I had done. I thought about it for a minute, and I said that, more than sorry, I felt kind of annoyed. I got the impression he didn't understand, but that was as far as things went that day. After that, I saw a lot of the magistrate, except that my lawyer was with me each time. But it was just a matter of clarifying certain things in my previous statements, or else the magistrate would discuss the charges with my lawyer, but on those occasions they never really paid much attention to me. Anyway, the tone of the questioning gradually changed. The magistrate seemed to have lost interest in me and to have come to some sort of decision about my case. He didn't talk to me about God anymore, and I never saw him as worked up as he was that first day. The result was that our discussions became more cordial. A few questions, a brief conversation with my lawyer, and the examinations were over. As the magistrate put it, my case was taking its course, and then sometimes, when the conversation was of a more general nature, I would be included. I started to breathe more freely. No one in any of these meetings was rough with me. Everything was so natural, so well handled, and so calmly acted out that I had a ridiculous impression of being one of the family. And I can say that at the end of the 11 months that this investigation lasted, I was almost surprised that I ever enjoyed anything other than those rare moments when the judge would lead me to the door of his office, slap me on the shoulder, and say to me cordially, "That's all for today, Monsieur Antichrist." I would then be handed back over to the police. That's the end of chapter 1. That was quite fast. Let me honestly, I could crank out another chapter. I mean, how long is this one? I mean, this one's barely anything too. Okay, well, even so, I should probably think about the. I gotta retain. Gotta retain. This one. I mean, this one was mostly just like a court case, almost, or like his court hearing. Started off with him talking about how he got arrested and how prosecutors were questioning him, and it's more about specifics. Let's see. What are some specific events that happened? I mean, who is the guy? I don't remember any names. I don't remember if names were mentioned, but the lawyer came to his house and asked him, like, "Hey, there's been some investigations into your private life, and we get the idea that you're a taciturn kind of guy." Whatever the fuck that means. I should probably Google that, actually. Taciturn? You motherfucker. 21st? Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm supposed to be Googling. Taciturn? Taciturn? I think that's the word. So that just means a reserved or uncommunicative, a person that's reserved or uncommunicative in speech, they say little. That sounds like Marcel almost perfectly. Okay. Calling him taciturn. How do you say it? Taciturn?
Taciturn.
Taciturn. Taciturn. Okay. And asked him, like, okay, so people get the vibe that you're taciturn and that you don't really express any emotions. Did you feel bad about your mom's funeral? Did you withhold emotions? He's like, no, not really. That would be a lie. I don't want to lie. Maybe he's just autistic. No, he's definitely got some sort of ASPD. I don't know if autism's excluded from that necessarily, though. I'm not an expert in any way, so I don't know. Then after he expresses, hey, I'm not going to lie about my true feelings. I'm not going to lie. And then they said, they got mad. The lawyer got mad and left. And then when he was being prosecuted, I think it was a prosecutor who was asking him questions about his confession, and he kind of just rolled with it. And then he, like, spazzed out and tried using, like, a crucifix on him to get him to, like, you feel bad. And he's like, no. I don't believe in God, bro. I'm good. It's a really rough summary. Now let's watch a summary video on it. Okay. I like this guy. He's really good. Not this ad. Course hero. See how accurate my retention is.
In part 2, chapter 1 of The Stranger, after Merceau is arrested, the examining magistrate questions him. This questioning feels pleasant for Merceau, who views his conversation with the magistrate as being like a game. Then Merceau is interviewed by his defense lawyer, who asks whether Merceau felt sad at his mother's funeral. Merceau replies that he is not sure because he doesn't analyze himself, admitting that even if he did love his mother, most people at one time or another mother wished their loved ones were dead. This answer upsets the lawyer, who tells Merceau not to repeat that at the hearing. Merceau's answers continue to upset the lawyer. Eventually, the lawyer, angry, leaves. Merceau wants the relationship with his lawyer to be good, but he understands that he makes his lawyer uncomfortable. Later, Merceau is brought again before the examining magistrate. The magistrate asks him to review his actions on the day of the killing. When the magistrate asks whether Merceau loved his mother, Merceau replies yes, the same as anyone, which is ironic because he loves no one. The magistrate asks why Merceau paused after firing the first shot.
He wouldn't answer.
Merceau does not answer. After this exchange, the magistrate takes out a silver crucifix and gives a speech about belief in God and God's forgiveness of a person's sins if he or she, like a child, asks for forgiveness. When the magistrate asks Merceau whether he believes in God, Merceau says no. The magistrate, upset, says that everyone believes in God and says that his own life would be meaningless if he did not have this belief. The magistrate thrusts the crucifix in Merceau's face and emphatically asks Christ to forgive Merceau. Merceau, tired and annoyed, agrees with the magistrate just to shut him up. The magistrate triumphantly proclaims that Merceau believes in God. However, Merceau replies,
I know.
no. Exhausted and amazed at Merceau's hardened soul, the magistrate asks whether Merceau is sorry about the killing of the Arab. Merceau says he is more annoyed than sorry. The magistrate leaves. Over the next 11 months, Merceau continues to have many routine meetings with the magistrate, many that include Merceau's lawyer. At the end of these meetings, the magistrate says, "That's all for today, Monsieur Antichrist." The legal officials, in the face of Merceau's seemingly meaningless actions, extend to Merceau symbols of traditional Christian beliefs, things that have meaning to them. These Merceau rejects. The magistrate says that Merceau's atheism is impossible because all men believe in God. Merceau believes that life is meaningless, but he always tells the truth, or at least what he views as the truth. Therefore, despite the vehement attempts by the magistrate to make Merceau claim socially acceptable views, Merceau says exactly what he thinks. He does not believe in the existence of God.
Okay. That was not great for my retention. I remembered everything as he said it, but I didn't explain that before watching the video, so. Alright, we'll just read the second chapter. Not opposed to it. Let's crack it out. Okay. My voice might get a little dry. I'm out of hot chocolate. I need a warm liquid now. I feel like getting up to go do it. So this one should be... Yeah, wait. Yeah, 10 pages. Okay, once I'll crack out 20 tonight. Alright. There are some things I've never liked talking about. A few days after I entered prison, I realized that I wouldn't like talking about this part of my life. Later on, though, I no longer saw any point to my reluctance. In fact, I wasn't really in prison for those first few days. I was sort of waiting for something to happen. It was only after Marie's first and last visit that it all started. From the day I got her letter, she told me she would no longer be allowed to come because she wasn't my wife. From that day on, I felt that I was home in my cell and that my life was coming to a standstill there. The day of my arrest, I was first put in a room where there were already several other prisoners. Most of them Arabs. They laughed when they saw me. They asked me what I was in for. I said I killed an Arab and they were all silent. A few minutes later, it got dark. They showed me how to fix the mat I was supposed to sleep on. One end could be rolled up to make a pillow. All night I felt bugs crawling all over my face. A few days later I was put in a cell all by myself where I slept on wooden boards suspended from the wall. Bugs all over your face while you're sleeping, dog? I had a bucket for a toilet and a tin waistband. Wash basin? Jesus. I had a bucket for a toilet and a tin wash basin. The prison was on the heights above the town. and through a small window I could see the sea. One day, as I was gripping the bars, my face straining towards the light, a guard came in and told me that I had a visitor. I thought it must be Marie. It was. To get this visiting room, I went down to a long corridor, then down some stairs, and finally, another corridor. I walked into a very large room brightened by a huge bay window. The room was divided into 3 sections by 2 large grates that ran the length of the room. Between the 2 grates was a space of 8 to 10 meters which separated the visitors from the prisoners. I spotted Marie standing at the opposite end of the room with her striped dress and her sun-tanned face. On my side of the room there was about 10 prisoners, most of them Arabs. Marie was surrounded by Moorish? I don't know what that means. By Moorish women, and found herself between 2 visitors. A little thin-lipped old woman dressed in black, and a fat, bareheaded woman who was talking at the top of her voice and making lots of gestures. Because of the distance between the grates, the visitors and the prisoners were forced to speak very loud. When I walked in, the sound of the voices echoing off the room's high, bare walls and harsh light pouring out of the sky into the windows and spilling into the room brought on a kind of dizziness. My cell was quieter and darker. It took me a few seconds to adjust, but eventually I could see each face clearly, distinctly in the bright light. I noticed there was a guard sitting at the far end of the passage between the 2 grates. Most of the Arab prisoners and their families had squatted down facing each other. They weren't shouting. Despite the commotion, they were managing to make themselves heard by talking in very low voices. Their subdued murmuring, coming from lower down, formed a kind of bass accompaniment. Oh my god. Accompaniment. Their subdued murmuring, coming from lower down, formed a kind of bass accompaniment. No way that's how that's said. No way. I'm gonna need that fucking announced to me. Accompaniment? 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 Oh god. Oh god. Accompaniment. Gee, I don't buy it personally, but these aren't real words. Bass of accompaniment. Okay. Their subdued murmuring coming from the lower down formed a kind of bass accompaniment to the conversations crossing above their heads. I took all this in very quickly as I made my way toward Marie. Already pressed up against the grate, she was smiling her best smile for me. I thought she looked very beautiful, but I didn't know how to tell her. "Well," she called across me. "Well, here I am. Are you all right? Do you have everything you want?" "Yes, everything." We stopped talking, and Marie went on smiling. The fat woman yelled to the man next to me. Her husband, probably a tall, blonde guy with an honest face. It was a continuation of a conversation already underway. "J.M. wouldn't take 'em," she shouted loudly as she could. "Uh-huh," said the man. "I told her you'd take 'em back when you get out, but you wouldn't take 'em." Then it was Marie's turn to shout that Ramon sent his regards and that I said thanks. But my voice was drowned out by the man next to me, who asked, "Is he all right?" His wife laughed and said, "He'd never been better." The man on my left, a small young man with delicate hands, wasn't saying anything. I noticed that he was across from the little old lady, that they were staring intently at each other. But I didn't have time to watch them any longer because Marie shouted to me that I had to have hope. I said yes. I was looking at her as she said it, and I wanted to squeeze her shoulders through her dress. I wanted to feel the thin material. I didn't really know what else I had to hope for other than that. But that was probably what Marie meant, because she was still smiling. All I could see was the sparkle of her teeth and the little folds of her eyes. She shouted again, "You'll get out and we'll get married." I answered, "Do you think so?" But it was mainly just to say something. Then very quickly, and still a very loud voice, she said, "Yes, and that I would be acquitted and that we could go swimming again. But the other women took her turn to shout and said that she had left a basket at the clerk's office. She was listing all the things she had put in it to make sure they were all there, because they cost a lot of money. The young man and his mother were still staring at each other. The murmuring of the Arabs continued below us. Outside, the light seemed to surge up over the bay window. I was feeling a little sick, and I'd like to leave. The noise was getting painful, but on the other hand, I wanted to make the most of Marie's being there. I don't know how much time went by. Marie told me about her job, and she never stopped smiling. The murmuring, the shouting, and the conversations were crossing back and forth. The only oasis of silence was next to me, where the small young man and the old woman were gazing at each other. One by one the Arabs were taken away. Almost everyone stopped talking as soon as the first one left. The little old woman moved closer to the bars, and at the same moment a guard motioned to her son. He said, "Goodbye, Mammon," and she reached between two bars to give him a long, slow little wave. She left just as another man came in, hat in hand, and took her place. Another prisoner was brought in, and they talked excitedly, but softly, because the room had once again grown quiet. It came for the man on my right, and his wife said to him, without lowering her voice, as if he hadn't noticed that there was no need to shout any more, "Take care of yourself and be careful." Then it was my turn. Marie threw me a kiss. I looked back before disappearing. She hadn't moved, and her face was still pressed against the bars with the same sad, forced smile on it. Shortly after, that was when she wrote to me, and the things I've never liked talking about began. Anyway, I shouldn't exaggerate, and it was easier for me than for others. When I was first imprisoned, the hardest thing was my thoughts were still those of a free man. For example, I would suddenly have the urge to be on a beach and to walk down to the water. As I imagined the sound of the waves under my feet, my body entering the water, and the sense of relief it would give me, all of a sudden I would feel just how closed in I was by the walls of my cell. But that only lasted a few months. Afterwards, my only thoughts were those of a prisoner. I waited for the daily walk, which I took in the courtyard, or for a visit from my lawyer. The rest of the time, I managed pretty well. At the time, I often thought that if I had to live in the trunk of a dead tree, with nothing to do but look up at the sky flowering overhead, little by little I would have gotten used to it. I would have waited for birds to fly by or clouds to mingle, just as here I waited to see my lawyer's ties, and just as, in another world, I used to wait patiently until Saturday to hold Marie's body in my arms. These are a lot of run-on sentences. Hold on. I would have waited for birds to fly by or clouds to mingle, just as here I waited to see my lawyer's ties, and just as, in another world, I used to wait patiently until Saturday to hold Marie's body in my arms. Now, as I think back on it, I wasn't in a hollow tree trunk. There were others worse off than me. Anyways, it was one of Mammon's ideas, and she often repeated it, that after a while, you could get used to anything. Besides, I usually didn't take things so far. The first months were hard, but in fact the effort I had to make helped pass the time. For example, I was tormented by my desire for a woman. It was only natural. I was young, I never thought specifically of Marie, but I had thought so much about women, about all the ones I had known and all the circumstances in which I had enjoyed them, that my cell would be filled with their faces and crowded with my desires. In one sense, it threw me off balance, but in another, it killed time. I had ended up making friends with the head guard, who used to make the rounds with the kitchen hands at mealtime. He's the one who first talked to me about women. He told me that it was the first thing that the others complained about. I told him it was the same for me and that I had thought it was unfair treatment. But, he said, that's exactly why you're in prison. What do you mean that's why? Well, yes, freedom. That's why. They've taken away your freedom. I never thought about that. I agreed. It's true, I said. Otherwise, what would be the punishment? Right, you see, you understand these things, the rest of them don't. They just end up doing it by themselves. The guard left after that. There were the cigarettes, too. When I entered prison, they took away my belt, my shoelace, and my tie, and everything I had in my pockets, my cigarettes in particular. Once I was in my cell, I asked to have them back, but I was told I wasn't allowed. The first few days were really rough. That may be the thing that was the hardest for me. I would suck on chips of wood and I broke off my bed planks. I walked around nauseated all day long. I couldn't understand why they had taken them away when they didn't hurt anybody. Later on I realized that was too as part of the punishment, but by then I had gotten used to not smoking, and it wasn't a punishment anymore. Apart from these annoyances, I wasn't too unhappy. Once again, the main problem was killing time. Eventually, once I learned how to remember things, I wasn't bored at all. Sometimes I would get to thinking about my room, and in my imagination I would start at one corner and circle the room, mentally noting everything there was on the way. At first it didn't take long, but every time I started over, it took a little longer. I would remember every piece of furniture, on every piece of furniture, every object, and of every object, all the details, and of all the details themselves, a flake, a crack, or a chipped edge, the color, and the texture. At the same time, I would try not to lose the thread of my inventory, to make a complete list so that after a few weeks I could spend hours just enumerating the things that were in my room. The more I thought about it, the more I dug out of my memory of things I had overlooked or forgotten. I realized that a man who lived that only one day could easily live for 100 years in prison. He would have enough memories to keep him from being bored. In a way, it was an advantage. Then there was sleep. At first, I didn't sleep well at night, and not at all during the day. Little by little, my nights got better, and I was able to sleep during the day, too. In fact, during the last few months, I've been sleeping 16 to 18 hours a day. That would leave me 6 hours to kill with meals, nature's call, my memories, and the story about the Czechoslovakian. So out of all the words that were really hard to read, Czechoslovakian just came naturally. But what was that other word? Fucking accompaniment? Made up fucking words. Yeah, accompaniment. Between my straw mattress and the bed planks, I had actually found an old scrap of newspaper, yellow and transparent, half stuck to the canvas. On it was a news story, the first part of which was missing, but which must have been taking place in Czechoslovakia. A man had left a Czech village to see his fortune. 25 years later, and now rich, he had returned with a wife and a child. His mother was running a hotel with his sister in the village where they'd been born. In order to surprise them, he had left his wife and child at another hotel and gone to see his mother, who didn't recognize him when he walked in. As a joke, he'd had the idea of taking a room. He had shown off his money. During the night, his mother and sister had beaten him to death with a hammer in order to rob him and thrown his body into the river. Did I read that right? In order to surprise them, he had left his wife and child at another hotel and gone to see his mother, who didn't recognize him when he walked in. As a joke, he'd had the idea of taking a room. He had shown off his money. During the night, the way the translations go, they like do periods after like every 5 words. It's so strange. As a joke, he'd had the idea of taking a room. He had shown off his money. Period. During the night, his mother and his sister had beaten him to death with a hammer in order to rob him and had thrown his body in the river. Period. The next morning, the wife had come to the hotel room and, without knowing it, gave away the traveler's identity. The mother hanged herself. The sister threw herself down a well. I must have read that story 1,000 times. On the one hand, it wasn't very likely. On the other, it was perfectly natural. Anyway, I had thought the traveler pretty much deserved what he had got, and you should never play games. So, with all the sleep, my memories, reading crime story, and the alternation of light and darkness, time passed. Of course, I read that eventually you wind up losing track of time in prison, but it hadn't meant much to me when I read it. I hadn't understood how days could both be long and short at the same time. Long to live through? Maybe, but so drawn out that they end up flowing into one another. They lost their names. Only the words yesterday and tomorrow still had any meaning for me. One day the guard told me that I'd been in for 5 months. I believed it, but I didn't understand it. For me, it was one and the same unending day that was unfolding in my cell and the same thing I was trying to do. That day, after the guard had left, I looked at myself in my tin plate. My reflection seemed to remain serious even though I was trying to smile at it. I moved the plate around in front of me. I smiled and it had the same sad, stern expression. It was near the end of the day, the time of the day that I don't like talking about, that nameless hour when the sounds of evening would rise up from every floor of the prison in a cortege of silence. Whatever that means. Cordage of silence. I moved closer to the window, and in the last night of day, oh my god, in the last light of day, I gazed at my reflection one more time. It was still serious, and what was surprising about that, since at the moment I was too, but at the same time, for the first time in months, I distinctly heard the sound of my own voice. I recognized it as the same one that had been ringing in my ears for many long days, and I realized that all that time I had been talking to myself. Then I remembered that the nurse at Mammon's funeral said, no, there was no way out, and no one can imagine what nights in prison are like. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 now. So homie's like dead ass in prison. He's just literally going crazy talking about being stuck in there. The days flow into each other. Reading crime stories, how I passed the time just playing memory games. He saw Marie visit him, and it sounded like they just kind of, the visitation isn't like traditionally in America or other pretty well-developed countries. It's like they just sit like 10 feet apart, 10 meters apart, and they like shout at each other, and people line up rows of 10. It's like 10 visitors and 10 prisoners, and they just shout at each other, and you gotta kind of hope you hear each other, I guess. It's kind of terrible. It's kind of awful, but it's interesting, definitely. Dude's a psychopath. I was really lost when I didn't realize he was reading a crime story. He talked about the dad just kind of got beaten to death by his daughter or his sister and his mom or his wife or whatever. That threw me off. And he's in a prison full of Arabs, talking about when they asked him, like, why are you in here? I shot an Arab 5 times on a beach. And they all just go silent. It's kind of crazy. But, I like it so far. It's an interesting book. I'm used to reading nonfiction. I'm reading this. I'm like, the hell? So, okay. Let's see what the next chapter review is. I'm going to see if my retention is good. I'm just trying to practice my retention and my reading ability. I don't like not being able to read too well. I'm trying to change that. So let's see how much I really retained.
In part 2, chapter 2 of The Stranger, on the day of his arrest, Mirceau is placed in a cell with Arabs who teach Mirceau how to roll a mat to make a pillow. Later, Mirceau moves to a Stark cell.
I like this. It's cute little animations.
And a tin wash basin. A guard tells Mirceau
Nope, that's just a dude. I promise there's animations. It's just an old dude.
The prisoners and visitors must yell to communicate.
Please switch. I'm not lying. Yeah. No.
Conversations of other prisoners distract Mirceau.
Okay.
Marie shouts that Mirceau should have hope, but the only thing he feels
Little cute
is a
animations.
desire to embrace Marie. Soon, Mirceau has to leave, and Marie throws him a kiss, her face pressed with a forced smile on it. Alone in the cell.
She's also crazy. She keeps asking, do you love me? And he's like, not really. Not really at all.
But then he realizes he cannot. These impulses last a few months. Eventually,
And then she comes back, we'll get married.
Smaller pleasures, like the color of his lawyer's tie. He tells the guard that he thinks not being allowed to have women or cigarettes is unfair. The guard reminds Mirceau that he's being punished by having his freedom taken away.
Yeah, I don't know. Is he like a retarded child, or is he actually like just a sociopath? He doesn't understand that's the punishment.
It's a game of trying to remember as many details about his room in Algiers as possible. He also sleeps 16 to 18 hours a day. Mirceau finds a newspaper article in the cell and reads it over and over. It relates a story about a man who left his home years ago but returned wealthy and wanted to surprise his mother and sister. But the mother and sister failed to recognize the man and murdered him for his money. When they found out their mistake, they killed themselves.
It's so crazy.
Days begin flowing into one another. For Mirceau, time feels like one unending day. He looks at his reflection in a tin plate and smiles, but his reflection keeps the same sad, stern expression. For the first time in months, he hears the sound of his own voice and realizes he has been talking to himself. He remembers the nurse at his mother's funeral saying that no one can imagine what nights in prison are like. This chapter also returns readers to the important theme of miscommunication. Rousseau does not like to talk much, and when he does have conversations, miscommunication is often the result. Rousseau could always play the game society expects and say he accepts Christ's forgiveness and that he was racked with grief at his mother's funeral. Perhaps then, appearing to accept religious and legal meaning in his life, he would be acquitted. But Rousseau's reaction to the news story shows that he abhors societal game playing. He says that the story affirms that you should never play games.
This is a weird book. I mean, like I've always wanted to read it. I wish it wasn't so fucking washed out. What if I turn this light off? You can kind of see it better. But I want to crank it out. I want to read the rest because I'm like, the stories, where is it going, right? I've heard some things. Like I heard some people say like he's simultaneously the biggest victim but also the fucking villain the entire time. I probably shouldn't have. It kind of sucks that got told to me because now I'm like second guessing everything he's doing. Like, is he acting like an idiot on purpose? Like he doesn't understand base human emotion, or he doesn't understand like, wow, I don't have my freedom. Maybe that's the punishment of being in prison. Maybe that's the point. I can't have my cigarettes? What? I don't know. It's probably a bigger thing. Maybe it's also speaking to be a metaphor, but I'm also like illiterate, so I have no idea. But I'll be back tomorrow, try and crank out 2 more chapters again, because I'm on chapter 3, and I think there's only about 5 or 6 chapters in part 2, so I'm almost done, which is pretty cool. But well, thank you for watching. Much love, kisses.